Where do I even begin? What started as a walk through my neighbourhood one day has transformed into a journey through history. And what a journey! When I first read the plaque on my street dedicated to the small patch of land that Jessie Traill donated to the community of Harkaway, I was intrigued. Restricted to only a 5 kilometre radius, like so many others, during what has been a monumental year, I found myself paying closer attention than ever before to the things closest to me, the things that I pass by every day. And this patch of land was one of those things. But instead of passing by like I usually would have, I stopped to read. And I admit there was not a lot of detail. The plaque spoke of the distant Jessie Traill, the humble artist who lived alone in Harkaway, dedicated to her art and faith. The grainy pictures of the prints that she did were hard to decipher on the weathered plaque, but I could see hints of the wide and intimate landscapes that she etched and the familiarity that it held to the places around me. And now I'm going to admit straight off the bat, I am a massive art nerd. And so I was really surprised that I didn't know about this, obviously, at the very least, notable artist connected to my local area. And so I decided to dig a little deeper, unknowingly setting out on an endeavor that would connect me with people far and wide, places close and far, and an artist of talent and heart whose story deserves to be shared by more than just a waterlogged plaque in a tucked away reserve. And no better way to unearth this story than through discussion. There are people scattered both within the Harkaway community and afar who hold fragments of Jessie Traill's story. And now, wherever you are listening from, whether in Harkaway or beyond, you too can piece together these fragments and discover a Jessie Traill whose legacy is not trapped in history, but still lives on today. From the limited information on Jessie Traill that I could find from a quick Google search, what did spring up was a book. A book published only this January, the biography of Jessie Traill. And aside from seeing this book and its recent release date as a sign that I was about to discover something fresh and exciting, the book's author, Jo Oliver, became my biggest informer when learning about the life and work of Jessie Traill. Jo's biography of Jessie is the most extensive recount of her life and practice that has been collated and published. It brings together excerpts of Jessie's own writing, anecdotes of those who knew her, and paints the story of what life for Jessie in the early 20th century would have been like. And beyond this, it is beautifully written, and the photos that are included from Jessie's life are enchanting. And I was lucky enough to sit down with Jo. One of the few blessings from this time is being able to foster connections between distance. And so all the way from New South Wales, Jo and I could meet face to face and talk about Jessie and indeed the significance that her story holds. It was a pleasure to talk to Jo, to see her in her own studio space and to listen to the birds out her window as we spoke. Jessie Traill loved birds, and so I hope you too might be able to hear them sing behind our discussion. And my conversation with Jo was the first of many to illuminate the life of Jessie Traill. And I had so many questions for her, and she answered them all with such enthusiasm and generosity. If there was to be an expert on Jessie Traill, Jo would be it. And this makes my discussion with her the perfect place to begin. But yeah, just start off by telling me a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Okay, well, I wear a few different hats, which is fun. I like my life. So I guess I can say I'm a writer and a printmaker. I also work part-time as a librarian in local history. So I'm involved in, historical research, and also oral history interviews is one of the main things I do at work, and photographs. So all those things together. I've had 4 children's books which I was the author and illustrator of those, published. And Jessie Traill's biography is actually my first adult book and my first biography. It's been a long-term project in between all the other things. And I'm now working on a biography of another woman artist who, again, I feel has been a bit neglected, and nobody has written, a full biography of her. So, yeah, it's become a bit of it has always been an interest of mine, Australian women art, and particularly printmaking.
So you're a printmaker yourself?
Yes. So I've learnt etching. My books, my children's books some are lino cut, some are one's etching, one's solar plate etching, which is a new way of doing etching that is much less toxic and less time consuming to produce a plate, but very effective. So, so I think understanding the process itself, the physicality of it, and it is a very physical process, also helped me to understand Jessie's work and to appreciate the amount of work that went into it, and that it was very unusual at her time for a woman to be a printmaker and particularly to be an etcher, and particularly to be an etcher in Australia. There wasn't that much happening.
And she makes it look so effortless as well. You're right. It's such like a physical, elbow grease type of medium. And she's got this curve and organic elegance within it. And so it's easy to see how we would not appreciate it as much as it should be, because she makes it look so effortless. And
that's right.
Yeah. How did you come about stumbling upon Jessie Traill in your research?
Well, I think it was way, way back, 1992, when I first saw Good Night in the Gully Where the White Gums Grow, one of her most beautiful, evocative prints, which was in a book by Roger Butler, who until recently was the senior curator of prints at the National Gallery of Australia. He's just retired this year. And so I saw that print and just fell in love with it. And I thought, I found that no one had written a biography of Jessie. And I clearly remember the first day that I said to a close friend who's an artist, I think I'm going to write a biography of Jessie Traill. And it just, I remember being quite nervous when I said it, because I'd never actually written that sort of in that genre before. But I thought, I'm going to give this a go.
And did you find it was quite a transition writing in that biographical style versus the fictional style that you've been used to?
I guess my work involves factual research, so that was the whole headspace that I'm used to, but I wanted to write it in a narrative style, so there was some crossover there, and for it to work as a narrative and as an accessible narrative, something that would be of interest to people in general, not just people who are interested in art history or anything like that. So I'm hoping that it's a book people might pick up and want to read, because they're interested in other people and women and lives and all those things. So so it seemed to be a fairly smooth transition in that way. I felt and do feel very responsible for making sure what I've written is factually correct. I know there's quite a lot of biographies now, or historic fiction, that sort of move across those divisions. And I did toss around the idea of sort of fictionalizing in the sense of trying to bring conversations to life or whatever. But I just felt that I just felt responsible for making sure things were right. And then that there was enough of Jessie's writing. This is what was beautiful about the project, because she wrote so much, and that's never been publicly read before. Her voice was there. And so, a lot of the book is bits of her voice, and me sort of joining up the gaps and giving the context and then letting her speak. And so, yeah, she was a beautiful writer and very lyrical in her descriptions and very visual, of course, being an artist. She's able to describe in words, what she's seeing. So, so yeah, that's how it sort of came about.
And she wrote so beautifully, you're right. Like, it's almost like you could kind of bounce off her tone. And she was like beautiful in her descriptions of her experiences. Did you have any favorite excerpts from her diary?
I have many, but one of my favourites is her description of the armistice after World War One. Yeah, just the scene in the hospital where she worked, I think is very evocative and very pertinent to our times. I mean, it's only just over 100 years that happened, and also that there were, at that time when she wrote that, they were dealing with the first of the flu, the Spanish influenza cases, which are a bit like what we're having now with COVID-19.
Doesn't feel like too much of a leap from that. You're right. Yeah. Should we read it out? That would be.
Love to.
That would be such a gift. I'll read along with you, but I would love to hear you read it.
So it's called, she called it Armistice Day 1918 by a VAD, which is Voluntary Aid Detachment, the group that she was working with. And it begins, scene, a big military hospital in France. The news has just come through. All the morning there was expectancy in the air. Now something has happened, something different than ever before. Something we have been waiting for, hoping for all these years. What shall we do is the question on everybody's lips. We all used to imagine what we would do when the war was over. Let's do something now. The great square of the hospital, such a busy place at times with convoys coming in or going out, is quiet and deserted. A few orderlies and up patients crossing leisurely, discussing the news. The night staff are waiting about before going to their quarters, waiting for something to happen. The air is full of tension. Something must be done, but nobody knows exactly what. Where's the colonel? Can't he do something? The matron is asked. What shall we do? Do, she says. Why? And goes on with her work. Then it is that the inspiration comes to one of us VADs. She is an English girl, a teacher in a little village school in the Midlands, who left her home for the first time to give herself heart and soul to her work for our boys, and who, after all these years in France, has returned to her village and her old mother and to the daily round of teaching year after year. When everybody is wondering what to do, she does it. None of us are bold enough, resourceful enough, but she is equal to the occasion and makes that day for everybody. By the side of the square hangs an iron rail from a post, the fire alarm, which is used for the church bell on Sundays. This she starts striking with the hammer that lies by it, stroke on stroke. The matron's pet dogs who howl on Sundays at the sound come out in a dismal row and howl. Stroke on stroke, and the great empty square fills with hurrying figures. They come from the great grey building. They come from the huts built among the chestnut trees of the garden, defended by sandbags this last year against air raids. Stroke on stroke, the whole place is alive. Medical officers, sisters, nurses, orderlies, every patient who can walk and those who can't hear and know what the sound means. The call has come, the move is made. She has done her work. Now the crowd does the rest. The padre brings out the portable harmonium. A patient with bandaged head installs himself as organist, and we are singing the national anthem, the Marseillaise, the Old Hundred, everybody at the top of their voices and from the depths of their hearts. The colonel and the matron are not asked for now. The lead came without them, and only a few knew how. Over the road at the convent of St. Vincent de Paul, the good nuns in their great white caps have mustered their children by the gateway, called by the sound, and they too are singing their songs and ours. It is all over as quickly as it began. It lasts but 10 minutes at the most. The crowd vanishes, each to his own task, and the night staff gladly rest. The busy hospital couldn't stop for long. The tension is gone. The necessary something has been done, and we can go to our work content and happy.
Beautiful. And to think that Jessie wrote that, you know, all the way back, all those years ago, being there and having experienced that, and how we can connect to it today. It's just beautiful. Thank you so much for reading that, Jo. And so as you continued your investigations of Jessie, were there any little surprises that you came across along the way?
Well, don't get me started. I could talk all day about the surprises. It was one surprise after another. Well, and I have explained this in the preface of my book that I went to Malakuta first. That was the actual order of it, where Jessie had done another beautiful print of hers that I love, a few different prints there. And I was sketching there one day. I was staying in an old guest house that, which is probably where she stayed. It was built a couple of years before she was there. And I got chatting to a woman who was also staying there, and we got chatting. I said I had started to research Jessie Traill, and she said, "Oh, I think I know that name. I think my sister curated an exhibition of hers." And I was flabbergasted because there hadn't been many exhibitions. And it turned out her sister was Claire Williamson, who'd curated an exhibition in Brisbane. Then going on to Harkaway itself, which I had never been there, beautiful Harkaway, where I know you live now. And I'd been in touch with the local historical society, trying to find out exactly where Jessie's studio was and whether it was still there. And he put me on, said it had just been sold, put me on to the estate agent. And the estate agent gave me the number of the person that had bought it, which is unheard of, really. They don't normally give out that sort of information. Anyway, small town, you know, friendly.
Classic Harkaway, right?
So I rang him, and he said his friend was using the studio as a writing retreat, I think, and that if he'd tell him I was coming, and if he wasn't there, that I could climb over the gate and walk up and look at the studio. So I turned up there, and this little country road, very quiet, and lots of gum trees, and there was the gate, and it was locked. So big, you know, one of those big farm gates. So I climbed up the gate and jumped over and walked up this driveway, quite a long, couldn't see the studio at the beginning of the driveway. So a curving driveway that curved up between gum trees. And then as I came to the final curve, I could see the studio sitting amongst the gum trees. And pretty much just as it had been when Jessie had been there. And so I looked around it and looked in the windows. I couldn't go inside, but I could see, I mean, it's really only one room, so I could see inside and see the light falling from the studio windows, which she had put on the southern side in Australia, not wanting direct light inside. And I was only accompanied by the bird song and the trees, and yes, it was a very moving experience. I really felt like I was going to meet Jessie herself. And I was glad that I was there just on my own without having to talk to anybody else. Yeah, it was a wonderful experience, because at that stage it was still very much as she'd left it, almost like she'd just gone off, maybe on one of her travels, and I happened to be there. So that was very special. And then, of course, I went on to the State Library of Victoria, where her papers were held, and I had organised ahead of time to have them out ready for me to look at. And when I walked into the research room, they said someone else was using them today. And I thought, oh no, someone's beat me to it. It turned out to be Serena, curator of prints from the National Gallery. And although we were supposed to be silent in there, and I'm a librarian, I should know better, but anyway, we couldn't help whispering. I think we might have got into trouble for whispering. So we basically shared the boxes. And then we got together, when we had a break at lunch, and talked about what we'd found. And so that was the beginning of a very fruitful, ongoing connection and friendship. We're still in touch now about other things that we're working on. So that was wonderful too. And I'd organised to go to Canberra on the way home because I was going to go to the War Memorial and see what they had. And so Serena organised for me to meet Roger Butler, who has written and collected a lot of Jessie's work at the National Gallery. And so within 3 days of, meeting Serena, I was sitting up having afternoon tea with Roger Butler in the members' lounge of the National Gallery. And then he organised the Rebecca Edwards, who was the Gordon Darling intern, to take me down into the bowels of the National Gallery where all the work is stored, and bring out Jessie's work and show me without the glass on it. So that sort of, gave me shivers. That was really beautiful because you never see it, the etchings without glass over them. So she was able to show me those, and then we continued to communicate, and they were preparing for, I didn't say that. So Serena was in Melbourne because she was preparing for a retrospective exhibition at the National Gallery of Jessie's work, and I was invited to speak at that. And then it travelled, and Roger asked me to open it out at Dubbo, open the exhibition and speak there. So that was all wonderful.
I think it's beautiful to hear how things lined up. I feel like it almost feels like it's the right time for Jessie, like her not revival, she doesn't need to be revived, but our discovery of her is now. And that's really special. People are turning their eyes towards women artists and this acknowledgement of the diversity of Australian art history. It is not what we thought it was. It is not this little Heidelberg square box. It is so much more expansive, and Jessie's one of those artists that we get to now turn our eyes to. It's beautiful, and more people are kind of getting on that train. You're getting on that train. I'm getting on that train. Roger Butler's getting on that train. It's really, really exciting. I will, if you want, just because you did bring it up. And I'm so intrigued by the artworks that you were talking about. Did you have any favorite artworks of Jessie's that you've come across? And yeah, I'd love to hear you speak about those.
Okay, well, again, I have lots of favorites, but one particular one, which is probably one of her most famous ones, is Goodnight in the Gully, Where the White Gums Grow. So that was produced in 1922, and I think it's representative of her distinctive style, particularly of landscape and the Australian bush, and it embodies her great love for the Australian bush. It's an etching and aquatint looking through trees. There's light coming through in the distance. So the trunks of the slender white gums are in the foreground, and they extend out of the picture frame, which we're very used to that sort of thing now, but it was actually quite radical at the time. People made sure their whole tree was in the picture. But I think it captures that individual view of what it's actually like. You're not normally, when you're standing looking, you're not seeing the whole of the tree. You're seeing just the bit that you're seeing. So it was a daring composition, and it has been said since that it prefigures Fred Williams' work. And I think the effect of it is both gentle and strong. It's decorative, in the sense that decorative was used at the time, which was a positive feature in that it has design elements, but also representational, which Jessie always wanted to be. So I think it sensitively evokes the mystery and the beauty of the bush. And she was somebody who was an early environmentalist and had a strong connection to the bush. So, and her use of aquatint and the way that she used the etching, again, was quite radical for the time. It's quite painterly in its effect. And there were very strong opinions about how etching should be done at the time. Whistler had actually written a bit of a treaty with rules of what you were supposed to do. Well, it breaks all those rules. Prints were supposed to be very small. They were supposed to be completely wiped. So you wiped all the surface ink off the plate and just left what was in the line. Whereas Jessie would leave what's called plate tone, where you leave the ink, some ink on the plate. So yeah, it was radical, but I think it's quite beautiful and stands the test of time. So that's definitely one of my favourites of hers.
I love hearing you talk about it and looking at it now. Like you're right. She's composed it in a way that when I walk around Harkaway now, I see white gums like this. And that's one of the things that I originally connected with Jessie's work, is I thought to myself, oh my gosh, she's painting the scenery that I see around me now. And those trees grow up near my grandparents' place and they're around my community. And like, I'm getting shivers now looking at it because it's beautiful. And you're right. Jessie doesn't strike me as someone who is going to play by the rules all the time. She's daring in the way that she does things, and that makes her work really striking.
Yes, and although she wouldn't have seen herself as a modernist, she did prefigure some of the modernist ideas of things like picture plane, composition, that sort of thing. So although she was in a sense working on her own, she was experimenting with some of those.
And she was appreciated overseas as well. Like we forget that she wasn't just, exhibited here. She went and exhibited in London, and I'm sure especially there where there was, obviously lots going on in the art scene. This would have been something that they would have recognized for its artistic merit and for its daringness, whereas we might have lost that to an extent in Australia because we just weren't there yet.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
No, that's beautiful. And I think you showed me another work as well that was your favorite. Did you want to have a chat about that as well? It's quite a different piece subject matter wise.
It is. Well, I thought it was representative. So we're talking about Red Light Harbour Bridge. And that's a picture of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. It's actually when the bridge is finished. Jessie did a number of etchings from the building of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and they have actually been included in some modernist exhibitions as prefiguring modernism, because they were unusual shapes and unusual compositions. But she was certainly very, very skilled at understanding engineering works, and there were comments by engineers who said, she understood how things worked. But it works beautifully as an artwork, an unusual line of sight in it, or your viewpoint from under the bridge, so looking up at the enormity of it, it almost fills the entire plate. And again, she's used aquatint to give us a softening effect, I suppose, which is a bit unusual in that the bridge is usually portrayed in quite harsh, with quite harsh and strong line, but she's softened the whole effect. And the inclusion of the red light is unusual for her and for etchers of the time, to have little bit of colour there. But it just draws your eye and adds to it. So she did many etchings of and paintings of buildings and engineering works, but I think that one really brings together some of the special things about her talent.
Absolutely. And you're right about this softness that she brings to it, because as quite an industrial mechanic piece of subject matter that was very kind of representational, as you said, of this like modernizing Australia. You know, we've built this mammoth construction out of strong steel, and it's bridging a gap between two faraway places. And she's brought to it the softness that she almost kind of applies to her bushworks and that tranquility. And she takes it and puts it on something man-made, which I think it's gorgeous that she has this dual fascination between the natural and then the man-made, but she doesn't treat them as entirely different. She brings this attitude of awe towards both of them, which is we can pick up so beautifully through her imagery. And I love the lighting in this image as well. The kind of the way that, as you said, compositionally you're looking out, but you feel like you're sitting within the shadow, and it's there drawing you towards this lightness, and you can kind of step out of that shadow into it. It's beautiful in its composition, and in its, there's even a sense of like hope, I don't know, as we kind of emerge from below to see the light within it. It's beautiful. I can see why it's your favorite, and it's one of my favorites too.
And I think, you know, you touched on something there which I think is worth expanding, that sense of hope. And I think one thing that joins together Jessie's landscapes and industrial subjects is that is people, because she was very conscious of the fact that these buildings and these works were that people were making them, and that it was providing people with jobs. So she did quite a few etchings of electricity stations, you know, things that sound not very attractive in themselves, but they were all, well, they were either post-World War One work for returned soldiers, or in the case of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, it provided work in the Depression, the 1930s Depression, and again a link to today, hard times when people were out of work and the government decided to borrow and invest, you know, money in the building of things to give people work. And so there's a human, even though there's not in that particular print, there's no people. There are in the other ones of building the Harbour Bridge, but there's the idea of people behind that, and you know, a story of giving people work and having hope. Yeah, so I think that's ties them together in that sense.
Absolutely, that's beautiful. I'd never made that connection myself, but I think maybe I knew it and had never articulated it, because I think that's why, as people, we connect to Jessie's work, because she is creating it for us in a sense. Like it's got an awareness of its viewer within it and what the scene means to the viewer. It's so special. Like, I don't know, I feel it and I get shivers looking at it.
I think that's so true. That the viewer, you're conscious of her as viewer, and therefore you as viewer, she shared that view. And that's why I found, you know, with the research, that when I read of her writing, that gave context to where she was working. You know, it gives the background story of the people involved, and
and that's why it's so exciting to also not just look at Jessie as an artist, but Jessie as a person, and to understand Jessie and what was motivating her works, and what she was interested by, and the relationships that she did have with others. And I think to an extent, one of the reasons that we can understand her more today beyond her artworks is because she made relationships with people, and her work spoke to people who are now still talking about her today. And those stories are being passed through. I think she captured hearts as much as she did eyes, you know, with her work.
Yeah, definitely. And she was, you know, very involved in charitable work, and apparently most of her exhibitions, the money went to charity. I mean, she did have financial independence, which, you know, was a great boon for an artist and a woman at that time. But nevertheless, she was prepared to interrupt her practice many times to care for other people, most obviously during the 5 years that she spent in World War One volunteering. I mean, she didn't know it was going to be 5 years when she went. Nobody did. They thought it would be over by Christmas, as they said. But it did, you know, she had to keep signing on every 6 months to stay. And so she could have left and gone back. And in fact, she ended up being one of the longest serving volunteers. And she even stayed after the war because, of course, the hospitals didn't close down until everybody had been able to be moved and gone home. You know, it took probably about another year before everybody was home again.
It's beautiful because you're right. She stepped beyond herself in that sense. And what she did was not out of any kind of desire to feed into what she wanted to do in her own kind of little opportunity with life. She went and she offered what she had to others, which is touching. And I think something that as Australians, like we should be proud of. We should kind of be lifting that on a pedestal and saying, this is the Australian spirit. We go and there's this sense of mateship, not just in our service men, but in our service women, that we do stick our hand up and we do sign on, and it is tough, but these are people in our history that capture an Australian spirit, which is, it's beautiful. And it does make me beg the question, why, for someone who captures the Australian spirit and who was a, you know, precursor to incredible modernist practice and was one of the first women to be practicing etching and was working along people like Tom Roberts and Arthur Streeton and, you know, the Boyd family. Why do you think Jessie Traill is less recognised in our Australian art historical narrative?
Well, I think there's a few reasons. Well, one is that printmaking particularly has not been as perhaps highly regarded as painting, or as obvious as painting. It hasn't had the exposure, perhaps. But probably more importantly than that, it was a boys' club. It was definitely a boys' club. So the coverage of women's, you know, in the number of reviews that there were, the number of exhibitions, all that sort of thing. And particularly in Melbourne, printmaking was fairly Sydney-centred at the time. There was the Lionel and Norman Lindsay, who were, yes, very much part of the boys' club. And Sydney Erie Smith. So they were definitely working with Whistler's rules, as it were, of etching. So they weren't recognising, you know, Jessie's work. I think to a degree she didn't, although she did exhibit extensively, she wasn't a self-publicist in the sense of, and I think, you know, most artists struggle with the fact that they want to do their work, not promote their work. And yet without that, you know, unless somebody else becomes a patron or, you know, takes it on for them, it's necessary. Also, I think that she was an individualist. She did have a lot of friends, and she had a lot of artist friends, women artist friends, but she was not part of a group as such. And so although she contributed, say, to group exhibitions, they were with a variety of styles. So that was, you know, didn't have that exposure in that way. but I think, and even probably the most, all those reasons are definitely part of it. But as I think we've touched on, that she was willing to have her work interrupted for other needs, and particularly to do with people. So whether that was volunteering in the war, raising money for refugees, the receipts and that in her papers show she was constantly giving to charities and supporting things, and writing support letters of support and seeking funds from other places, setting up appeals for certain causes. She was an early environmentalist, so she was active in that way. And also she was a great traveller. So, and that, I mean, that was connected to people too. So some of her friends and family were overseas, and so she travelled to see them. So although she was utterly committed to her art practice, it didn't preclude involvement in life, in a sense, life with people. And so all those things, have worked together to mean that she, I think, hasn't been as recognised as much. And as you say, there's been, the Impressionists have sort of pride of place. And I mean, she certainly had strong connections to them too. But it's time to have a look at some of these people that have been, particularly women artists who have been less recognised, and women printmakers, even narrower subject area. And the other person that I'm writing about now was also a printmaker as well. So it's great to see them recognised.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, obviously from this discussion today, that it's certainly not that she is not worth recognizing. From everything that she has done, we can see very clearly that there's so much to be gained from recognizing her. I just think that maybe she wasn't afraid to make the job a little harder for us. Like, we can't just, she's not going to lay out everything for us very nice and neatly and tie it in a bow and reduce herself to just her art practice. She wasn't going to do that. She was going to make the most of things and live a full life and live a charitable life and live a relational life. And that's harder for us as art historians and researchers and appreciators of her artwork. But it's also reflective of who she is. She's multifaceted. She's not going to be tied down. She's not simple. We can't just, find her out in one single exhibition. We have to discover her and get to know her intimately. And I think that's more rewarding in the long run.
Yes, definitely.
This podcast has been narrated and produced by Grace Watson, assistant producer Josiah Kopp. The theme music is Ottorino Respighi's Pines of Rome, and special thanks, of course, to guest Joe Oliver.